Hi, I'm Joy Kiriakou. I'm from the Executive Council of the Sydney Peace Foundation. At the Sydney Peace Foundation, we're really worried about the impact of a warming climate on peace and access to justice around the world. So we've started this new series called A Climate of Peace. We're going to be interviewing eminent thinkers and change makers on climate action in Australia, on the things that they're doing to really tackle climate and also peace and justice. So today I'm joined by Bryn O'Brien and Dan Gocher. They're from the Australasian Centre for Corporate Social Responsibility, or ACCR. And I'm going to talk to them a little bit about some of the really unique and powerful work that they're doing on access to climate justice. So welcome and thank you very, very much for joining us, Bryn and Dan.
Thanks,
I'll
Joy.
jump straight in and ask the first question, which is that, so ACCR, as I was saying, does some pretty unique work, particularly in the Australian sphere. So can you start by telling us a little bit about the work that you do, and also why you chose climate as one of the issues that ACCR focuses on?
We're an activist shareholder organisation, which makes us pretty strange in the Australian landscape. What activist shareholder means is that we hold small positions, so small shareholdings in really large companies listed mostly on the Australian Stock Exchange, and we go and engage with those companies about their environmental and social performance. So we hold companies like BHP and Rio Tinto, Woodside, Santos, Qantas, so all the big names in the Australian listed corporate landscape. As to why we chose climate injustice as one of the issues that we focus on, I mean, Australian companies are some of the world's biggest polluters. It is our responsibility to engage with those companies to try to change their behaviour and to try to reduce emissions.
Excellent, thank you. So I guess one of the things that I find interesting, and I guess people would be keen to know, is how do you find shareholders when you go, yep, we want to work on this particular AGM or this company and climate? How do you find shareholders who are willing to work with you and to get more support for the kind of things that and actions that you'd like companies to take?
One of the ways is by having conversations like this, Joy. In order to engage with a company through the formal process, so to use the rights under the Corporations Act to file shareholder resolutions with a company, what we need to do is find 100 shareholders in that company who agree with us and who are concerned about climate or labour rights or human rights or whatever the issue is. So finding those 100 people is that hold shares in a company and that care about these issues is a real challenge. So we try to go out through our networks, through orgs like the Sydney Peace Foundation, and find where that interest is. So we are always on the lookout for people who care about corporate responsibility and hold shares or want to hold shares in listed companies. You only need $500 of shares in order to be able to trigger those rights, or 100 people with $500 of shares. The other thing that we do, of course, is we engage with institutional capital. So once we have those 100 shareholders, we go out and we talk to the investment sector and we try to persuade our big super funds, our big asset managers that they should also care about these issues. And that's really where, so you have our base of 100 shareholders, you have our institutional constituency. We try to bring those concerns and those different kinds of power together to address climate justice at companies.
Amazing, awesome. So one of the things that people may have heard about recently, because it was in the newspapers, was that you've had some pretty impactful wins. Particularly this year, you had a really impressive win at the AGM of Woodside Petroleum. If people don't know, Woodside Petroleum is a massive company based in WA. It is one of the biggest producers of natural gas in Australia. And you had a big win at their AGM with more than 50% of shareholders supporting a motion that you were championing. So I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about that, how you got to that win, and then also what you think wins like that really mean for companies like Woodside and others into the future for Australia?
I'll take this one. So firstly, I'm a bit of a pessimist, so I don't actually classify it as a win. It might be the beginning of the end rather than the end of the end. It's a step along the way to getting Woodside to take climate change seriously. How we got there was, I guess, we started doing this work. Well, I started doing this work maybe 5 years ago. So it certainly wasn't, kind of an overnight victory. We got there by having those conversations with investors for a long period of time about the importance of this issue and the importance of companies like Woodside taking climate change seriously. The 50% vote is a pretty big milestone for us. When we started filing these resolutions 3 years ago, we were getting 5 and 10%. So to get 50 is, it felt great, but ultimately the company hasn't changed yet. So until the company, walks away from some of its expansion plans and starts to set realistic climate targets, then really it's just another step along the way. So big votes are important, but they're not the win that we really need at this stage.
Can I just ask, what would you see then as a big win? Because I feel like that was pretty amazing.
Look, it is, and I think the other thing that gets lost in it also is that there was also a very big vote on lobbying, and a lot of our work on climate is about lobbying, and that's about the role that companies play in either lobbying positively or negatively for climate policy. And if you know anything about Australian climate policy over the last 20 years, some very large companies have stood in the way of good policy for a long time, and their industry associations. So it's important that we're getting big votes on lobbying too, because that really is the roadblock to good policy. I think a good win is as a company setting really ambitious emissions targets, and we've engaged with Telstra, certainly not at the same level we have with companies like Santos and Woodside, but Telstra made an announcement yesterday that it would be net zero by 2050, but it will be taking substantial emissions reductions before then, and that'll include emissions from all the steel it uses to build poles and wires and so on. So there are companies out there making ambitious announcements, but we really need to see it from some of our big emitters too. Great,
thank you. So I guess keeping a little bit on the topic of gas, which leads on from Woodside a little bit, you guys have also really criticised the government's, some of the response or planned response to COVID-19 in terms of it being what's been called a gas-powered recovery. So I'm interested in what ACCR would see and you would see as a fair and just economic recovery from COVID-19, and how you would see energy fitting into that mix. If not gas, then what?
I guess the two biggest criticisms we've had of this kind of gas-fired recovery is one that the commission, the Recovery Commission, is stacked with executives who have a vested interest in gas-fired recovery. Be they directors of gas companies, or they have large shareholdings in gas companies or infrastructure companies. So there's that, which it almost smells like corruption. And then the other issue is that, you've got this once in a generation opportunity where the government is going to spend a huge amount of money on stimulating the economy. Mm-hmm. And how should that money be spent? Mm-hmm. To be spending it on fossil fuels in the age of a climate crisis just seems absurd. The government could be spending it on, and, even if it's, if you accept that the government should be intervening and spending money on renewables, that's fine. There's a whole bunch of other things that it could be spending money on. Whether it's climate adaptation, making homes and more resilient in places that are prone to natural disasters, or to encourage energy efficiency or electric vehicles, or there's any number of things. But ultimately, also, you've got to look at what sectors of the economy have been hit the hardest, and it's certainly not the resources sector. It's the arts, it's tourism, it's hospitality, it's retail. So if the government's serious about a recovery, then it should be also talking about those sectors and how it gets people back into work there, rather than, giving people jobs in the oil and gas sector.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last couple of questions we're asking all of the people who we interview in this series, and they're really about those links between climate, peace and justice. So the first one is, what do you see as the consequences for peace and justice of a continued failure to act on climate?
Couple of ways into this question. One is that climate change is everything change. Climate change is a threat multiplier for all of the kinds of human rights and justice issues we have around the world, including in Australia. Climate change, just during the bushfires, affected, people's human rights. Fundamentally the right to life. Those bushfires were deadly. Their rights to, a safe place to live. The bushfires destroyed, irreplaceable cultural heritage sites on the New South Wales South Coast and kind of eastern Victoria. These things, and a whole heap of people were displaced. So climate change is an absolute. If we have 4 degrees of warming, we will have no justice, no peace. We will have total chaos. And frankly, we are not kind of taking those problems, those threats to peace and justice seriously enough. But our economies are not just now. Fossil fuels extractivism is not a just system. It relies on exploitation, on the trampling of Indigenous people's rights, and total inequity. So we have an opportunity for a more just world if we respond well to climate change, a more peaceful world if we respond well to climate change and equitably, and if we factor in the intersecting struggles of climate justice and racial justice and First Nations justice and workers' justice. So there's an opportunity, but there's also this insane threat. And to be frank, we're on absolutely the wrong trajectory now. We're on the road to chaos, and we need to move to the road of justice.
So the next question I'm interested in getting an answer from both of you on, and it's unfortunately our final one for the short interview series. So it's to ask if you could guarantee that just one action was taken, and this could be action by anyone who holds power, it could be action by government or action by companies or whoever you choose. If just one action was taken in order to halt or lower the impacts of a warming climate, what would it be?
Well, look, we know science tells us, atmospheric physics tells us what that action is, and it is to stop extracting and burning fossil fuels. Now, we need a process to do that rapidly. The pandemic has demonstrated to us that huge economic shifts can be taken to protect the safety and life of people. And we have to do that. We have to respond in that way to climate change. We need to stop extracting and burning fossil fuels.
I would second that, but I guess the other thing we can do is stop cutting down trees. Stopping deforestation is really important, and reforestation is just as important. Not just for the impact on the climate, but also for biodiversity. And everybody can do that. You can do that at a local level. You can. It doesn't necessarily have to be a federal government initiative. The same way you can reduce your own carbon footprint. Everybody can plant trees.
Excellent. Look, thank you both so much for your time and for those incredibly interesting answers and viewpoints. I'll just finish up by saying that I'd encourage everyone to look up the Australasian Centre for Corporate Social Responsibility online, to look up both Bryn and Dan on Twitter. They're really worth a follow. and look into their work. The centre does incredible work, not just in the area of climate, but in labour rights and a range of other areas, and is really pushing the Australian corporate sector in ways that they haven't been before, which is amazing to see. In terms of the Sydney Peace Foundation, we really hope that you enjoyed this session of A Climate of Peace. The Sydney Peace Foundation exists to look at solutions to peace and access to justice. And you can keep supporting us by following us also on social media and checking us out at sydneypeacefoundation.org.